Welcome back. We're in the part where health stops being abstract and gets uncomfortably personal. Today it's trauma, emotional health, and why waiting for symptoms is basically a terrible strategy. And honestly, the emotional part hit harder than the numbers for me. Because the body stuff is one thing, but the inner critic part is brutal. That voice in his head sounded like a full-time bully. A very committed, very unhelpful employee. What got me is he didn't frame it as weakness. He framed it as adaptation. That changes everything, because then you're not broken, you're coping badly. And that is a much harder truth to avoid. Right, because once you call it an adaptation, you have to ask what it was protecting. The whole thing about neglect being enough to shape someone was powerful. Yeah, not every wound is dramatic, and that's almost the point. Sometimes it's the missing thing, not the violent thing, which is weirdly more relatable for a lot of people. Because then the kid builds a system around avoiding pain, and that system survives into adulthood. And then it looks like personality when it's really just old survival software. Old survival software is such a devastating phrase. But it fits, especially when he talked about anger, addiction, and codependency. Those aren't random moral failures if they started as protection. Exactly, and that distinction is huge because shame makes people hide instead of change. Shame is such a scammer, honestly. It sells certainty and delivers garbage. The residential treatment part was wild, though, because he basically had to be forced into recovery. 2 weeks, then 3 weeks, and he still said that wasn't even enough the first time. That's the thing. Relapse doesn't always look like relapse. Sometimes it just looks like incomplete repair. And the ultimatum from the marriage makes it feel painfully real. Sometimes the people around you see the train coming before you do. What I loved was the rehab analogy, because it wasn't about moral transformation overnight. It was, you broke something, now learn how not to break it again. Which is such an anti-self-help way to describe healing, but probably the most useful way. The inner voice exercise was insane to me, though. Imagine recording yourself being kind to yourself like it's a hostage negotiation. Dear therapist, today's evidence suggests I am not dead yet. Exactly, and then doing that daily until the critic just disappeared. That part is actually hopeful because it suggests repetition can overwrite identity. Not overnight, not magically, but still measurably. And the fatherhood angle is where it gets heavy because the cost wasn't just internal. It spills into your partner, your kids, your whole house. That line about collateral damage was rough. Because that's what people forget when they glamorize being a wrecking ball. Nobody puts that on a LinkedIn profile. The bigger point, I think, is that emotional health is not some side quest in Medicine 3.0. It's the first gate, because if your mind is wrecked, your body strategy gets wrecked too. And then he pivots to the 5 tools, which is where his whole framework really lands. Emotional health, exercise, nutrition, sleep, and molecules. What I liked is he didn't pretend medicine is bad, he said it's incomplete. That's a fairer critique because medicine is incredible when the house is already on fire. It's just less impressive when you're asking it to stop the fire before it starts. The exercise section was the one where he went full preacher, and I get why. The hazard ratio stuff is crazy once you actually sit with it. Smoking, diabetes, high blood pressure, and exercise all in one language is kind of terrifying because it strips away the vibes and forces you to see risk as math. And the math is rude, honestly. The math has no manners whatsoever. A smoker being roughly 50% more likely to die in a year is already bad. But then top VO2 max versus low VO2 max being a 5-fold difference is outrageous. 5-fold is not a lifestyle tip, that's a warning siren. And the crazy part is he made it sound almost boringly measurable. Like, do the test, know your number, stop pretending ignorance is innocence. That's the most annoying good advice possible. It is because nobody wants their fitness score to come with consequences. I also liked how he explained that VO2 max isn't about lungs in the way people assume. It's mostly heart output and muscle extraction, which is a much cooler problem. Human beings are basically delivery systems for oxygen and regret. That's actually not a bad tagline for the episode. Then muscle strength and muscle mass become the hidden anti-fall insurance policy. That hip fracture stat was brutal because people think falls are just falls. But after 65, a fall can become a whole mortality event. That's the part young people just cannot emotionally process. No, because at 30, you still think your skeleton is sponsored by the universe. Sponsored by the universe is wild. The glucose argument was the cleanest explanation, though, because muscles are storage and control. He basically said a teaspoon of extra sugar can represent a disease state. 1 teaspoon sounds absurdly tiny for something so catastrophic. That's what makes metabolism scary, because the scale is tiny and the consequences are huge. And it makes muscle feel less cosmetic and more essential. Which is probably the point of the whole framework, right? Health is not a medical appointment. It's a long-term operating system. And most people are running it like a cracked beta version. The real argument here is timing, not just treatment. Medicine 2.0 shows up late. Medicine 3.0 tries to show up early. And early means before the body has already shouted at you, or before the mind has quietly trained itself into a cage. That's actually the scary part, isn't it? The biggest losses often happen before the diagnosis, which is why the prevention angle feels less like wellness branding and more like survival. We should probably leave people with that because it's the real takeaway. Thanks for hanging with us, and next time we're getting even deeper into the longevity toolkit. Episode 3 is where the practical stuff starts getting very real. Welcome back, because this one gets uncomfortably personal fast. We're talking trauma, the inner critic, and why waiting is so expensive. And then we pivot hard into Medicine 3.0 and the 5 tools nobody uses enough. Which is wild, because the body is basically begging us to intervene earlier. The trauma part hit me first, because he's not talking in abstractions at all. He's talking about how people adapt when they don't get what they need. And that adaptation can look like anger, addiction, avoidance, or just weirdness. Which is such a polite word for, my coping mechanism is now my personality. Bro, that is exactly the thing people don't want to admit. He's basically saying, separate the behavior from the self. Not excuse it, not celebrate it, just understand it. That distinction is huge, because shame makes everything worse. Shame tells you you're defective, so why would you change anything? Exactly. And then he describes that voice like it was running the whole building. The inner critic line was brutal, because it sounded absurdly familiar. The archery example was insane, though. Imagine breaking an arrow because your ego missed a target by 3 inches. The arrow did not sign up for your emotional breakdown. No, it really did not. But that's what's wild, because it was never about archery. It was just a perfect place for the self-attack to show up. And then the therapy exercise was almost embarrassingly simple. Talk to yourself like you'd talk to your closest friend. Which sounds cheesy until you realize most people are monsters to themselves. And he did it every day until the voice changed. 4 months later, it was gone. That is not a self-help slogan, that is a behavioral rewrite. The part about inpatient treatment also matters, because he didn't do this with vibes. He did it with actual structure, actual pressure, actual accountability. Sometimes the truth is you need a container bigger than your excuses. And he even says he probably didn't have a choice. That marriage ultimatum bit was real life, not inspirational branding. Which makes the whole thing feel more human, honestly. What got me most was the I might not be alive part. That's a huge sentence to say out loud. Because it means the self-hatred was not just uncomfortable, it was lethal. And then he links it to childhood without turning it into a blame ritual. That's the subtlety people miss. Not all damage is dramatic. Sometimes it's neglect, or missing attention, or learning the wrong rules. And kids turn that into adaptation because that's what kids do. They protect themselves with whatever tools they have. The tragedy is that the protection can become the problem later. That is the whole emotional health category right there. And then he moves into the 5 tools, which is where the medicine critique really opens up. Emotional health, exercise, nutrition, sleep, and molecules. One of these is barely used, and one of them is used too much. Guess which ones? Modern medicine basically loves the 5th one and neglects the first 4. That contractor with 1 tool line was perfect because it is exactly that. If all you have is medication, every problem starts looking like a prescription problem. And meanwhile, nobody is asking what your sleep, movement, or stress looks like. Which is crazy, because those are the levers with massive downstream effects. The exercise section is where he goes full mad scientist, though. The hazard ratio stuff sounds like he's trying to scare the room into cardio. But the numbers are brutal, because they make fitness look like a survival metric. Smoking, diabetes, blood pressure, kidney failure, all of it gets compared to exercise. And then VO2 max comes in and just humiliates everything. Top fitness versus bottom fitness is a five-fold difference in all-cause mortality. Five-fold is absurd. That's not a small edge. That's a different life. And the best part is he explains it without making lungs the villain. It's really about heart output and muscle efficiency. So the body's engine is only as useful as the parts that can use the fuel. Exactly, and that is why muscle mass and strength matter so much. He makes the glucose point in a way that finally lands. Muscles are storage, muscles are sink, muscles are regulation. So if your muscles are weak, glucose has nowhere to go and life gets messy. That 1 teaspoon of sugar line was nuts, by the way. 1 teaspoon and the whole system starts falling apart. That's how fragile metabolic health actually is. Then he ties muscle loss to falls, and that part is terrifying. Because after 65, a broken hip can become a death sentence. Not instantly, but function starts collapsing and recovery gets ugly. That's where the whole longevity conversation stops being abstract. It's not live forever, it's don't lose the ability to move, recover, and resist decline. Which is a much less sexy pitch, but way more useful. Health is always trying to be unsexy and annoying. And then it ends up being the most expensive thing to ignore. I also liked how he kept bringing it back to age 30. Because at 30, you think you're invincible, which is basically a personality disorder. That's savage, but also true. And his point is not that 30-year-olds need to panic. It's that they should invest before the bill gets huge. Especially emotionally, before you hand your unresolved mess to a family. That line landed hard because prevention is not just blood pressure and cholesterol. It's also preventing the kind of person you become under stress. That is the real Medicine 3.0 argument. And honestly, it makes the old model look kind of lazy. Not evil, just late. Exactly. And late medicine is still valuable, just not enough. This episode is basically a reminder that biology rewards boring consistency. And that trauma is not a side plot, it is part of health. Which is why this whole thing feels bigger than a fitness conversation. It's about whether you're willing to become aware before pain forces awareness. All right. That's the gut punch for this chapter. We'll be back with the actual longevity playbook next. Episode 3 is where the practical tools get way more specific. And yes, some of them are annoyingly simple. Welcome back. This episode gets into Medicine 3.0, trauma, and why waiting is so expensive. It's basically the argument that prevention is not a luxury, it is the whole game. And somehow the most dangerous stuff is the stuff that feels boring at 30. Which is exactly why everybody ignores it until their body starts filing complaints. The trauma part hit me because he is not talking only about dramatic abuse. He is talking about neglect, abandonment, enmeshment, and the weird ways kids adapt. That is the part people dodge because it is not cinematic enough. Apparently, your nervous system does not care if the trauma had background music. Exactly. It just remembers the pattern and starts building around it. And that is where the whole self-blame thing gets dangerous. Because the story becomes I am broken instead of I adapted. That distinction is tiny on paper and huge in real life. It changes everything about how you look at your own behavior. He kept coming back to maladaptive patterns like anger, addiction, and codependency. Which is brutal because people love moralizing those things. But he is saying the move is curiosity, not judgment. That is harder than it sounds, because self-righteousness is addictive too. What stuck with you more, the trauma piece or the medical prevention piece? Honestly, the trauma piece, because it explains why people sabotage themselves for decades. And then the medical side becomes the cleanup crew after the damage is already normalized. That is such an ugly sentence, but it is painfully true. He made a big deal out of those 5 tools: emotion, exercise, nutrition, sleep, and molecules. And the punchline is medicine only really respects one of them once people are already sick. Pharma gets invited to the party, and exercise is left outside in the rain. That is exactly the vibe, though. The wildest thing was how specific he got with exercise and mortality. Like once you start comparing hazard ratios, the numbers get absurd fast. Smoking, diabetes, blood pressure, kidney disease, then fitness just stomping all of them. That was the moment the whole room probably had to sit up straighter. Because exercise is not sexy enough to sound that powerful. But VO2 max being that predictive is kind of insane. He is basically saying your engine matters more than your excuses, which is rude but fair. And the lungs are not even the main bottleneck, which surprised me. It is heart, muscles, oxygen use, all of that combined. So when he says the top fit people versus the bottom fit people have huge mortality gaps, that is not motivational fluff. That is just biology being extremely literal. And honestly, the average doctor is not walking you through any of that. They will tell you to move more and send you home with a polite smile. The strength and muscle part felt almost even more concrete to me. Because muscle is not just aesthetics, it is glucose storage and fall protection. That diabetes point was wild too, like the difference can be a teaspoon of glucose. 1 teaspoon, and suddenly you are in a completely different disease category. That makes regulation sound less abstract and more like a hostage situation. Your body is basically trying to keep 1 teaspoon from ruining your life. And then the fall risk after 65 is where it gets terrifying. A broken hip or femur can become a death sentence in the real world. The mortality numbers there are so high they almost sound fake. But that is exactly why this is not a young person's debate. It is a future you problem that you either respect now or pay for later. And most 30-year-olds act like future them is some separate person. Future them is going to be furious, by the way. Future them deserves the complaint letter. What I liked is that he did not frame emotional health as a soft add-on. He put it right inside the longevity toolkit, which is a stronger claim. Because if your inner life is chaos, the rest of the health stack gets compromised. That is the part people do not want to admit out loud. Do you think people are finally ready for that conversation? Maybe intellectually, but emotionally they still want a pill first. Yeah, people love a supplement when what they need is a mirror. And that is why his therapy story landed so hard. He was talking about residential treatment, repeated attempts, and an ultimatum. That is not a cute self-care anecdote. That is a life or death reset. The honesty there is almost uncomfortable because it strips away all branding. And then he describes the inner critic like it is a voice rehearsing violence. That line about being defective is so common and so destructive. If you believe you are defective, accountability dies immediately. Because if you are defective, then why even try to change? You just sit there and wait for the autopsy, apparently. Which is horrifyingly accurate and also kind of ridiculous. The replacement voice exercise was one of the most practical things he said. Like literally talking to yourself as if you were helping a friend. That is embarrassingly simple, which usually means it actually works. Simple things are always the most annoying things to ignore. And apparently doing that daily for months can rewire the whole internal script. The part about parenting hit even harder for me. Because he is not just talking about healing yourself, he is talking about breaking inheritance. Kids absorb our unresolved stuff whether we are aware or not. That is the brutal part of adulthood nobody advertises. Do you think people underestimate how much childhood shapeshifts into adulthood? Constantly, because people want a neat origin story and trauma is rarely neat. They want one event, one villain, one explanation. But real life is usually 1,000 small things that taught your body how to survive. And then survival gets mistaken for personality. That is such a good line, because people defend their coping like it is identity. Which is why healing feels like an attack at first. I think the strongest through line here is that waiting is not neutral. Waiting on fitness, waiting on emotions, waiting on habits, waiting on age. Every year you wait, the bill compounds with interest. Even your denial is on a payment plan. That is disgusting, but true. And the crazy part is he is not saying panic, he is saying take inventory. That is a much more usable message than fear. Fear makes people freeze, inventory makes people move. All right, that's the gut punch for this chapter. We'll be back with the actual longevity playbook next. Episode 3 is where the practical tools get way more specific. And yes, some of them are annoyingly simple. Welcome back, because this one gets way more personal and way more useful. We are in the part where prevention stops being abstract and starts sounding brutally human. And honestly, it gets uncomfortable in the best way. The first thing that hits is how much damage people carry without even naming it. Not just abuse, but neglect, abandonment, all those quieter wounds. Yeah, the stuff that does not look dramatic from the outside. That is what makes it dangerous, because it hides inside normal life. And then the body adapts, which sounds helpful until the adaptation becomes the problem. That part is so weirdly tragic because the behavior was trying to protect you. Right, and then it shows up later as anger, addiction, codependency, avoidance. The body really said, best I can do is damage control. Exactly, and then everyone acts shocked when the damage control has side effects. What I liked is the refusal to moralize it. It is not, you are broken. It is something happened and you adapted. That distinction is huge because shame keeps people stuck. Shame says you are defective and then you stop looking for solutions. And his whole point is agency comes back when you separate the behavior from the self. Which sounds simple, but for people in the middle of it, that is a life raft. The therapy part was intense too, like full residential treatment, twice. That is not casual introspection, that is a full intervention. 2 weeks of trauma work every day is basically emotional CrossFit. And then he had to go back again because the first time was not enough. That honesty matters, because people love a neat before and after story. But the truth is he was not fixed by a nice insight and a candle. Unfortunately, trauma does not care about ambient lighting. It really does not. The inner critic example was insane, though. The fact that he was screaming at himself over archery is such a perfect picture. Over archery, man, not taxes or surgery. Just a hobby, and he is emotionally destroying himself over a missed shot. The phone exercise is almost embarrassingly simple, which is probably why it works. You hear yourself speak to a friend with compassion, and suddenly you notice how cruel the old voice was. That is the whole trick, really, making the cruelty audible. And he says it took months, which is important because people want overnight rewiring. Bodies and brains are annoyingly slow when you finally ask them to change. But then it changes how he shows up as a father, a husband, a boss, everything. That part hit me hardest because the collateral damage is always wider than people admit. He is basically saying, fix the emotional stuff before you bring more people into the blast radius. That is a wild way to describe it, but also probably accurate. And that leads perfectly into Medicine 3.0, because the framework is not just pills and procedures. It is emotional health, exercise, nutrition, sleep, and then the drugs and hormones layer. The funny thing is, medicine still acts like most of that is optional scenery. Call your doctor about your workout split and watch the room get quiet. They will absolutely not have a Zone 2 opinion for you. And then he goes into the numbers, which is where it gets almost offensive. Smoking, diabetes, high blood pressure, kidney failure, all those hazards are bad, obviously. But exercise keeps beating them in terms of mortality impact. That is the part people do not expect, because exercise sounds too mundane to matter that much. Yet VO2 max and strength are hitting with absurd force. Top fitness versus low fitness can mean a 5-fold difference in mortality. 5-fold is not a nudge, that is a cliff. And the muscle piece makes sense once you hear the glucose explanation. Your muscles are basically the storage system that keeps sugar from wrecking everything. So when muscle declines, the whole metabolic setup gets sloppy. Then add aging, falls, frailty, and suddenly muscle is not about aesthetics at all. It is about whether your body can survive the ordinary bad luck of life. A broken hip after 65 can be deadly in a way most people never think about. That is why waiting is such a bad strategy, because the downside compounds quietly. You do not notice the bill until the interest has already become the story. And that is the brutal genius of this whole episode, honestly. It is not trying to scare you into perfection, it is trying to wake you up early. Which is annoying because early effort is boring, but later effort is expensive. That is the sentence right there. Early effort is boring, later effort is expensive. All right, let's take that into the next one and get even more practical. Episode 3 is where the tools get specific, and some of them are going to sting.